this video, we're gonna be talking about an awesome new paddle from Neonic, the Flow Prime X, and how it stacks up with another great paddle they released just a week or two ago, the Flare Prime X. So let's dive in. And of course, a disclaimer that Neonic did send me these paddles, but they didn't pay for this review and they don't get to see it in advance. And if you want to save 10% on either of these paddles while helping this channel grow, you can use the code Pickleball Blast for 10% off of your order. And before we jump in, make sure you're subscribed down below. So the Flare Prime X came out about 2 weeks ago, and I released a shorter review video that I'll link up above here if you want to check it out. And now just a couple weeks later, Neonic is launching their Flow Prime X, and we're gonna dive into all the details. But if you're just here for the quick overview, I've got you. The Neonic Flow Prime X is a 16mm hybrid shaped paddle that is advertised as an all-court paddle that leans a bit towards the offensive side, and I think that's a pretty accurate statement. It has a slightly longer handle if that is important to you, and a good amount of power while feeling decently plush. It's also nice and quick in the hands and is similar to the Flare Prime X in a lot of ways while having some distinct differences, which we'll touch on in just a bit. It's a great value at its MSRP of $140, but it gets even better as it's on a Black Friday sale from today until the end of the month that brings it down to $112, and you can stack the Pickleball Blast code to bring it down to $100, which is crazy. And if you're here for the in-depth review, let's jump in starting with the basics. You'll see the stats for both the Flare Prime X and the Flow Prime X on screen here, which are in a lot of ways the same paddle in different shapes. But I'll point out again that these shapes are different, with the Flare being the standard shape and the Flow being a hybrid shape. The core thickness is different, with the Flare at 14mm and the Flow at 16mm, and there are some other subtle differences here as well. In these videos, I like to touch on a variety of categories when reviewing a paddle, so let's start with power. I mentioned that the Flow is an all-court paddle that leans towards offense, which would be those categories like power and pop, and they are both solid on this paddle. With power specifically, I feel like my drives and putaways are above average, but it's very controllable power to me. Compared to the Flare Prime X, I think the Flow is a bit lower power, but I didn't test this with a radar, so there's a chance that softer feel from the Flow is just kind of deceiving me. But I do think it would be safe to say, at least in my experience, it feels like less than the Flare Prime X, but not a major drop-off. Of course, in many instances, the flip side of that power is the control, and again, I feel like the somewhat more plush feel of the Flow Prime X leads it to be pretty decent in the control category. Now, it's still an all-court paddle, so it's not built specifically for control, and it's not a total pillow, but it is an easy touch to adjust to, and my soft game felt pretty natural with it. The Flow definitely beats the Flare on the control side for me. I actually was surprised at the feel of the Flare Prime X given its poppy nature, as it still had a nice feel to it, but the Flow definitely has the upper hand here. I think a good transition from there is to talk about that pop, as this is, in my opinion, the biggest difference between these two paddles. If you watch my Flare Prime X review, I mentioned the awesome pop from that paddle, which is a highlight of the Flare Prime X for me. While the makeup of the Flow and Flare are essentially the same and each include that fiberglass layer that often translates to pop, the Flow definitely dials that pop back. Now, after I played a few hours with both these paddles, I remember describing the Flow as being like the Flare Prime X if you were worried about pop getting you in trouble, and I think that's still a pretty accurate description. The spin on both these paddles felt pretty good to me, probably not the absolute top paddles for spin, but certainly not lacking either. Both these paddles felt like they had good dwell time for me, which I wouldn't expect from poppy paddles. And I didn't get a chance to record and test the RPMs for these two, but borrowing from my friend Matt at Matt's Pickleball, he found that both of these delivered results over the 2200 RPM mark, with the Flare slightly higher than the Flow. Now, my guess is that would transfer to something around the mid 2000 mark for me, as I find Matt's numbers to pretty consistently be slightly higher than mine. The hand speed of the Flow felt just slightly slower than the Flare Prime X for me, but with that said, the Flare felt like one of the faster paddles that I'd used, so the Flow Prime X still sits at a solid fast rating from me, and it felt good in hand battles at the net. And finally, on the visual side of things, I would give the edge to the Flow Prime X. I think the Flare is a step above the standard looking paddle, but the Flow takes that even a step further with some more color added to the paddle, as well as the gradient edge guard, which I am a big fan of. Now that we've done the deep dive, let's talk about these two paddles head to head in a general sense, who they might be for, and give you some direction if you're trying to decide between these two. Going back to our basic stats and looking at the categories that we discussed, we'll see that the Flare Prime X has the advantage in power and pop, and is a slightly faster paddle in your hands. On the flip side, the Flow has that softer touch that is going to work better for dinks and resets at the net for most people, and also, in my opinion, looks a bit better. So in my eyes, both the Flare Prime X and Flow Prime X could find a place with all levels of players. I think if you're a power player who likes to play aggressively and can control the pop that comes with it, or if you need help generating power on your own, you probably lean towards the Flare. If you play a slightly more conservative game, or like me, prefer a hybrid shaped paddle, then you probably lean towards the Flow. And both these paddles are a good option if you get bothered by heavier paddles and need to stick to something light. And finally, I think it's important to talk about the value of these paddles, which is an important aspect when considering where to spend your money. Neonic is not only making good paddles, but they are doing so at a really competitive rate. Both the Flare and Flow are priced below average for a well-made paddle with a great company behind it, which I think makes these specifically good paddles if you're looking to try something maybe a bit different than you normally would go for, or if you're looking for a first real paddle purchase, assuming they fit your needs and playstyle. All in all, these are two great paddles that Neonic has just released, and I'm excited to see continued innovation in the sport, and I'm looking forward to what they do next. If you have any questions about the Flare Prime X or Flow Prime X, leave them down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.